What's up, guys? It's Joe, and yes, we are finally back for the 2024 season. You might see a new face here. This is Ian. Welcome, Ian, to the show. He came with us to the Fantasy Football Expo. He's written a couple articles. He is now hooked, and he is now, uh, whether he likes it or not, part of the team. He's got um, a Yap Chronicles series going on their website. He just released the second one this morning. So, Ian, welcome to the team. What is your background with fantasy? If you want to give us like a quick 1 minute rundown.
Glad to be here, Joe. Thank you for the invite. Background of fantasy, I've just kind of been a casual player for a majority of my life. But I think as in my adult years, I've gotten very into, studying analytics and taking it probably a little more seriously than most casual people. A lot of casual people I know don't do 10 leagues a year. Um, And then, you like you said, you invited me to the Fantasy Expo. I talked to some people, I networked a little bit, and now I'm hooked. So I'm here now. So I can at least share my research with other people instead of keeping it in my personal Excel sheets.
Yeah, I can relate to that because I started selling this personal Excel sheets a couple of years ago. It ultimately ended up working out. But Ian had a really good first article, Yap Chronicles, where he talked about the importance of like how Marcus Valdez-Scantling was actually the key to unlocking the Chiefs' offense, which was really interesting. And it had a lot of ground to it. So awesome to see. As usual, Luke is also here. Hello, Luke. How are you doing today? How are you
Glad to
feeling?
be back.
Glad to be back. How are you now? A quick question before we get into the meat and potatoes of this. How has the fantasy season been treating you guys so far? I mean, first week, I feel like I had a pretty good first week. A lot of the players that I like have been doing well. First week was obviously overall disappointing as far as tight ends go and how other positions are. But Luke, how has the fantasy season been treating you up to this point?
Yeah, a slow start, but I usually get off to a slow start. The leagues that I won last year, I know one of them that I won. I started off 1-5 and ended up running the table and winning. So week one is usually slow for me. I on the tight ends, I did tend to draft tight end early this year, as I know a
As did
lot of
I.
people did. Yep.
Yep.
So all of the tight end stinkers kind of came to me for sure. I think out of my 10 leagues, I won in 3 of them. Not a great start.
What about you, Ian? What you got going on?
I'm about like 50-50 in record. I did draft a lot of Dalton Kincaid. If you read that article, I banked heavy into him. I'm still not worried. Like no one can make me unwaver in my Dalton Kincaid. I love him. But yeah, early tight end seems to have hurt a lot of people. But I'm very notorious for drafting second place teams that start off really good and then we sort of just fall off in the playoffs and lose in the championship. So I'm going to embrace losing a lot week one and hope it just means a better end of the season for me.
For sure. And I think one of the mistakes that I make every fantasy year, and I'll just kind of go into like general fantasy advice here. I tend to drop a lot of the players early and give up on them early more than I should. Uh, and that's a common issue for me. So I stashed Isaiah Likely and Jordan Mason in a lot of my leagues, which as of right now is looking great. But past me, like prior to week one, would have been like, oh, I probably don't need to hold on to this guy. I can probably drop him. So this year, my message to myself was hold on to the guys that you stashed, see what they turn into. Like Roma Dunze, I have in a lot of leagues, and Demarcus Robinson, who we're going to talk about in a minute. I had him, as Ian knows, in a ton of leagues, just kind of sitting on my bench, kind of seeing what it turns into. But yeah, so that was kind of my message to myself. But um, either way, let's move on. One thing I do want to mention before we get rolling is if you guys go on Underdog Fantasy, you can use my code ANALYST, and they're going to match your first deposit up to $100. So I put out some picks last night. Yeah, there you go, right here. My camera's inverted, so it's kind of throwing me off. But if you guys use code ANALYST on Underdog, we put out some picks yesterday. They hit pretty well. I think we only missed on 2 of them, and that was with Jalen Waddle. I thought we were going to get a bigger game from Jalen Waddle. And to be fair, he was on pace for a big game, but the game kind of got away from them and he lost his involvement, especially after Tua got hurt. But we're going to talk about that in a second. So make sure you guys check that out. Let's talk about last night. Last night's game, Miami Dolphins versus the Buffalo Bills. Obviously, not a pretty game for the Dolphins. Tua, he unfortunately suffered another concussion, another bad concussion, I might add. I was looking at some videos about him. Our friend of the show, Fantasy Docs, he's really good about putting out content about players as soon as they get injured. Tua had a pretty serious concussion and he did something called fencing, which is when you get hit so hard that your hands kind of do this straight vertical type deal. We've seen that before with Tua, so we can expect a lengthy absence from Tua. And honestly, I think it might be time to hang it up for his own sake, for his life. But outside of Tua, which is a really unfortunate situation, Tyreek let a lot of people down. This Miami offense as a whole, other than Devon Achane, let you down. But Ian, I want to hear your thoughts on some of the Buffalo Bills. I know you're a big Dalton Kincaid guy, as you mentioned before. You said you're not worried about Dalton Kincaid. If you want to break that down a little bit more.
I do. So first off, before I get to Dalton Kincaid, I actually was very high on consensus, or like over consensus on James Cook. I liked his touchdown progression as opposed to like regression, especially considering the fact that they don't have a lot of weapons and he has the most volume in the offense returning into this season. And I think we saw that last night with a receiving and 2 rushing touchdowns. I think I can expect more of that. I had him as my 20th overall player, right behind Devon Achane. And I don't want to victory lap too early on that, but it looks pretty good. I was surprised that he was being drafted outside of the RB1 range. I think he's going to be a lock for RB1, for as a fantasy RB1 for the rest of the season. In terms of Dalton Kincaid, it seems like a lot of defenses are trying to take him away, especially week 1. He was the only guy that really had any kind of noticeable target share returning from last year. I think that the Cardinals defense, especially not being a very good unit, they just wanted to take away Josh Allen's safety blanket and see what he can do. And he put up 34 on him. So I think we saw a little bit this week where the middle of the field opened a little bit. When the game was tighter, Kincaid was splitting targets with Khalil Shakir, which is what we want to see. But then obviously when the game got out of hand, Skylar Thompson comes in. Kincaid got that weird knee to the head when he was on the ground. They just sort of stopped targeting receivers and top targets overall. I think that projects well for closer games. He will have boom games that will make up for some of the slower starts, but seeing how they tried to get him involved early, he's going to be a part of this passing attack. And I still like the value considering you got him after the Laportas and the Andrews and the Kelseys of the world. So I'm not worried there.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I think what I liked about Kincaid too was it seemed like early in the second half and early in the first half, they were going to him. Like it seemed like all of Kincaid's targets came like in the first drive and then the first drive of the second half. Like they really wanted to get him started early. He was the catalyst for this offense to kind of set up James Cook to do what he did as well. And what was really interesting about James Cook as well is he had a goal line carry, which I think the Bills got to, like, I don't know if it was the 2-3 yard line. And, I was at a bar with some friends and we're like, all right, here comes Josh Allen. All our Josh Allen over TD props that we have set up are about to hit. And then it was a James Cook. I believe it was a carry on the left side. It was like, well, that sucks for us, but good for James Cook if you have James Cook. So, Luke, I'll give you a second if you want to add anything on, any takeaways you saw from last night, maybe from the Miami side, because we did talk about the Bills quite a bit. And if Tua is gone, what is your concern level on Tyreek Hill, or your confidence rather in Skylar Thompson?
Yeah, everybody takes a hit if Tua's out long term. I mean, we saw Skylar Thompson in the playoffs last year. It was ugly. We saw him the year before that when Tua and Teddy Bridgewater were both hurt. It was also ugly. I think Tyreek Hill will still be startable. I mean, he's not going to be the second overall pick or third overall pick that you drafted him to be in your fantasy leagues. But outside of him, I don't know where you look. I think Devon Achane, they're going to have to get him involved. Maybe Mostert if he comes back healthy. I'm probably staying away from Jalen Waddle at this point. Again, depending on how long we see Tua out for. But not a bright outlook going forward for sure.
I actually think that Tua needs to retire. I only played high school ball, but I knew a couple guys that had 4 or 5 concussions, and it's like doctor recommended that you retire because like you're not only at risk for CTE. I mean, Antonio Brown even tweeted that Tua needs to retire due to concussions, which is crazy, straight from the horse's mouth.
Ironic.
Type of CTE intel. But I mean, just from everything that I know about having multiple concussions is like once you're past 3 or 4, you're putting yourself at a really big risk for like degenerative brain disease. I think Tua seems like a great guy. I was never like that high on him as a quarterback. I know he's pretty accurate, but he can have some trouble processing the field and extending plays. There is a guy out there who used to play for Miami who was being talked about as a Jordan Love replacement. I think Ryan Tannehill could make his return to Miami. I think he profiles pretty well in that offense. He's a 1-2 read guy. He can extend plays. He's a little mobile. I think his arm strength is on par with Tua's. I feel like he could walk into this offense with no problems, and Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle would both go back to where they were pre-Tua injury. So hopefully that happens. We've seen Skylar Thompson come in before. I'm not quite sure why Mike McDaniels is attached to this guy so much. He's a very below average backup.
Yeah.
I do think they're going to bring somebody else in.
Yeah, if it's a long, lengthy absence for Tua, I would imagine, as you said, that they bring someone in, and Ryan Tannehill is at the top of that list as far as free agents go. So maybe we'll get a reunion. We will see. But let's move on. Before we get into our individual picks, and if you guys have listened to these episodes in the past, me and Luke have done this thing where we've gone over every single matchup, which I think is great and has its moments. But for the sake of time, and for organization purposes, we've all picked 3 players that we wanted to highlight for this week. So we're going to take turns going through those players. But before we do that, I do want to talk about some situations that we're monitoring going into week 2. And by that, I mean, one of the biggest things is this Rams wide receiver room with Puka Nacua. He apparently has a torn or partially torn PCL, and he's on IR currently. He's going to miss likely more than the 4 games that he is on IR for. The timeline I've heard is 4 to 7 weeks. Again, a lot of this information comes from our friend Fantasy Docs. I'm going to put his Instagram in the caption below, but he's very quick and very accurate and very good about getting these things right. So Puka Nacua dealing with that bursa knee injury and that PCL partial tear. He's going to miss 4 to 6 weeks. This leaves Demarcus Robinson, who I kind of preluded to before as someone who I had in a lot of my leagues stashed on my bench. And a big reason for that was, yes, I mean, like we had Puka injured prior to the season. We've had Cooper Kupp injured just about every season before that. So there was reason to believe that a third wide receiver in this offense may become important at 1.1. And 2, the Rams offense under Sean McVay has been one of the best for wide receivers for a long time. They were first in target share to wide receivers last year, and they were first in 11 personnel last year, meaning they had 3 wide receivers on the field. I think it was about 70% of the time. So, yeah, I mean, this is a team that heavily targets wide receivers and heavily utilizes wide receivers. And that makes sense given the fact that tight end has not been a priority for them, and running backs just really haven't gotten that much involved in the passing game. So, with Puka injured, what does this offense look like? So Demarcus Robinson played 92% of the snaps last week. Kupp obviously played 100. The third best was Tyler Johnson, Tyler Johnson had his moment, but Tyler Johnson has had his moments in the past before. We've seen Tyler Johnson, especially with the Bucs, have big games, big touchdowns, and we're like, all right, this is it. This is the breakout. And then next week he disappears. He did kind of go into that Puka role, which I think is interesting. So like, when Puka went out, he kind of came in and played the same role that Puka would, as opposed to Demarcus Robinson, who was just going to play the Demarcus Robinson role. But just because he's playing the Puka role doesn't mean he's going to get Puka targets. He's not guaranteed to get those targets. So Demarcus Robinson, for me, is still the one that I'm targeting in this offense. And Sean McVay said himself when talking about the wide receiver room, he said, we have Kupp and we have Demarcus Robinson. And then he followed up by saying, we have 3 other guys. So Robinson was in that conversation with Kupp, and Robinson also had 15.4 fantasy points per game last year from weeks 13 to 17. So he seems to be a pretty important part of this offense. Ian, I talked to you about Demarcus Robinson before. You also mentioned, I think, before we talked, that you have Tyler Johnson stashed in a dynasty league or two. Do you have any hope for Tyler Johnson on this team, or are you floating towards Demarcus Robinson? What are your thoughts?
So I think it's Demarcus Robinson is the safe bet. And I think especially like when you invested a lot in him early in the season, I think that's fair. And seeing the target or the snap share that he got is very good. But he profiles as the X receiver, which even like when Odell was there, who was like an elite X receiver in that offense, he did see significantly less volume than a guy like Kupp. You're more so hoping for him to win his one-on-one matchups, which he can do. Demarcus Robinson has been a pretty good 50-50 ball guy. He was a pretty consistent X receiver in that Chiefs offense for a while. I think Tyler Johnson may see, even if he doesn't see the whole portion of Puka's volume, he doesn't need 11 targets a game. If he's getting 6, 7, and he's able to break one out every game, he did get a couple of goal line targets in that game too, which intrigues me a lot, even though it was a pretty bad throw from Stafford, and I think it got picked or almost picked. That's a high volume target going across the middle in the red zone, especially in an offense that doesn't use their tight ends. I have him stashed in a couple of deeper leagues. I wouldn't, if it's only like a 10 to 12 team league, I don't know if it's worth banking a roster spot into unless he does it again, because that snap share is so low. But in a roster where I have 20 bench spots, yeah, I'll take a flyer on Tyler Johnson for sure.
Yeah, why not? If it's that deep, and if there's going to be a lengthy absence as well for Puka, and you have the bench spot, it's like, look, if Tyler Johnson ends up being something, it's worth having him on your bench. So
Yeah,
otherwise,
I dropped Miles Sanders for him. So I think I was okay.
No harm, no foul. No,
Yeah.
nothing lost there. The next situation we want to talk about is this Packers offense without Jordan Love. We talked about Jordan Love a little bit before, and Luke, I'll get to you on this one because I know you're a big Jordan Love guy. But the latest on Love is that he's day-to-day, which is great news because when he initially went down, some people thought it was ACL season ending. We didn't know exactly what was going on with Love. And then the recent news suggested that with an MCL injury that he does have, it's not a full tear, it's a partial tear, so that means a sprain. He is likely going to miss like 2 to 4 weeks. We didn't know exactly what the timeline was. And then the most recent news I literally just saw this morning is that Jordan Love's day-to-day. And if he doesn't play this weekend, which is looking like the most likely scenario, he should be a shoo-in to play next week against Tennessee. So with Jordan Love out, though, for this week, my thoughts on the offense are this. You're not, Malik Willis is no Jordan Love. Malik Willis is no half of Jordan Love. So if I'm the Packers offense, as LaFleur does, I'm going to scheme Malik Willis to get the ball into the playmaker's hands. You want the ball in the hands of guys who can do stuff after they catch it. So Jaden Reed, that's the first name that comes to mind. They're going to scheme up plays to get Jaden Reed in space, allow him to do what he does after the catch, as they were doing with Jordan Love, by the way. I mean, last week, Jaden Reed ripped off multiple touchdowns because he was in space. So I'm going to downgrade Christian Watson. I think Josh Jacobs is going to be a big focal point of this offense as well. It'd be interesting to see if Marshawn Lloyd plays. And then Tucker Kraft and Luke Musgrave, they were really good about getting those guys into kind of great matchups last week as well. I remember Tucker Kraft taking, I think it was like a sideline catch for 10 to 15 yards just because he had so much open space in front of him. And that's what LaFleur does best. So I feel good about Jaden Reed. I don't feel great. I'm not taking a shot on Christian Watson. But Luke, what are your thoughts on some of these Packers playmakers here?
Yep. Being in the comments of our posts and stuff very often, I usually have a couple favorite interactions of the week. And by far, my favorite interaction this week was on our waiver wire post when I saw someone commented, not even going to mention Malik Willis. And Joe, you very cleverly responded, I mentioned that you should start the Colts defense against it, which was a great response and kind of sums up my feeling here. I do think Jaden Reed is startable, especially being that yards after catch guy, seeing what he did in week 1 in that matchup. I mean, those field conditions were terrible, and they were still putting the ball in his hands as often as they could and just trying to let him loose. He put up a great week. But yeah, I'm not comfortable with this offense at all. This is going to be an extremely low scoring game, in my opinion. I mean, we saw them. Your argument about scheming things up for Malik Willis does hold with guys like Jaden Reed, but we saw Malik Willis fail to even put a ball up in a Hail Mary opportunity last week when he came in for Jordan Love. The obvious play was just throw the ball up, and he took a sack with 0 seconds on the clock. I don't have much faith. I honestly can't believe that the Packers had like 4 quarterbacks on their roster, and they ended up with Malik Willis as the backup who's going to come in and play. I'm shocked by that. I don't have much faith in this offense at all.
They traded for that man. They gave away assets for Malik Willis. What did they see? Like, what were they cooking? I guess we'll
see this week. Yeah, we'll find out.
Because even when I just saw that the Titans got back any value, 2 of my best friends are Titans fans, and I text them immediately like, "Did you ever expect to get anything back from Malik Willis?" Like, the lights were so bright in that guy's first start that he fumbled 2 snaps. Like, the experiment was over before it started. That being said, Fantasy Pros has Jaden Reed as wide receiver 36. I found that to be a little bit low, but they have him right behind Ladd McConkey on the Chargers, and I find that very interesting, as one is a very boom pick and the other one can be a very like high floor pick. So I guess maybe that says more about like fantasy philosophy than anything else. But I guess I'll kick it off to either one of you guys. But like, who would you take in that situation? Asking for me because I have both of them in one of my teams.
So, you kind of said it yourself. One's an upside play, one's. But I don't even know if I'm ready to call Ladd McConkey a safe play either, because Joshua Palmer, someone who I know you're a fan of as well, did get booted out of last week's game, given there wasn't that much time left in the game anyway. But we didn't get to see a full game of Joshua Palmer. Ladd McConkey got the touchdown. He led the team in targets. That's great, but I don't know if I'm ready to call this rookie the consistent or safe play. So I'm going Jaden Reed. I think we saw the upside last week. He did a lot of that work himself last week anyway, so I think that's what I'm going to roll with. And I do want to move on and talk about Chris McCaffrey, because this is the third situation that we're looking at this week. We have obviously, you draft him number 1 overall. They call it a calf injury before the season. They said he's a shoe-in to play. Nothing to be worried about. And then he misses the first game, and then we hear that he might miss beyond that. Apparently, it is Achilles tendonitis, which, again, friend of the show, Fantasy Docs, he's been great about getting all these updates out. It's not something to be concerned about long-term, as long as it isn't... how do I say, like, if he re-injures his Achilles, or if he pulls it, or if it gets worse, because there's no added risk to rupture his Achilles because of the tendonitis, but it is something that could linger. So the thought from the doc this week is that he will be out this week. That is the thought, even though he did practice on Wednesday, and then he should be back the week after, and he doesn't have any long-term concerns. So if it was playoffs, apparently Chris McCaffrey would have played last week, which makes sense because apparently he was close. But in the meantime, Jordan Mason. I mean, what a great debut from Jordan Mason. I think he had like almost 30 touches. He was very efficient on the ground. And what I was surprised about too is how they involved him in the passing game. I wasn't expecting him, this undrafted free agent, to come in and kind of own that CMC role, but he did. And he played it well. And they kind of used Debo as a counterpart to that as well. Debo had his rushing attempts as well. So we'll see. We'll see what this offense looks like. Brandon Ayuk, you can't really take too much away from last week. He didn't practice much up to that point, and he had a really tough matchup as well. So not taking too much from that. Do you guys want to add anything to that before we get into our picks? No? Yeah, pretty straightforward. If Christian McCaffrey's not playing, you're playing Jordan Mason. Not too much to say from that. So now what we're going to do is we're going to get into the meat and potatoes of this, which is each of our picks. Luke, why don't you start us off? Give us your first pick. And by the way, when I say a pick, I mean this is a player that we're highlighting for good or bad reasons. Could be a player that we want to start this week, player that has a good matchup, or just the opposite, player that does not have good matchup when we do not want to start. So, Luke, why don't you go off on one of your players?
Yep, I'm going to start with JK Dobbins, who is my favorite start of the week. Coming off of an incredible week last week. I know looking at the underlying stats, I think he might have finished as like the RB3 or 4 last week. But looking at the underlying stats, looking at our snap percentage posts, he basically split with Gus Edwards and just was more productive than Gus Edwards. I expect that to kind of continue. I think they'll basically split. Maybe Dobbins will see 60% this week as opposed to 50-something percent. But he was much more efficient than Gus Edwards was. And they're playing the Panthers this week. That's my number one bullet point right there. The Panthers looked awful last week. Just about everybody that touched the ball scored a touchdown against them last week. Foster Moreau is currently the tight end too. So not much else to say there. I expect this to be if not a blowout, a game that the Chargers are comfortably winning by third quarter, beginning of the fourth quarter, and they're just going to get the ball in the running back's hands. The Panthers lost Derek Brown last week, probably for the season. He's not only their best defender, but by far their best run defender. This defense is going to get run all over. The Harbaugh way is going to destroy this team, and I think JK Dobbins is the main benefactor of that.
Yeah, I'm pretty on board with everything you said. I have no problem with starting JK Dobbins, especially after his big week last week. And his involvement in the passing game, I think, was nice too. And going to the season, we looked at this Chargers offense and we're like, all right, with knowing Harbaugh and knowing that this is going to be a extremely run heavy team, there has to be someone. Someone has to be the guy here. Someone has to be the main benefactor. One of these guys is going to be a top 15 running back, and we just didn't know what that looked like. And if we knew J.K. Dobbins was going to be healthy and looked as good, I guarantee you we all would have been pointing at him. But Gus Edwards seemed to be in the lead prior to the season just because he was the first one signed, and the familiarity with the coordinator and all that kind of stuff. So that's all right. But Ian, why don't you go off into your first player for this week?
Sure. So actually, on the other side of that matchup, I really like Diontae Johnson this week. With it is a hard sell. So bear with me here. I know the Panthers look bad, and I know Bryce Young, all of the fears look like they're coming true. However, week 1 is a liar. They did get better at the end of last season. Specifically, Bryce Young got a little bit better. It's a new offense, a new offensive coordinator, and he's got new weapons. He didn't really have a primary X receiver last year. They still are using Thielen in that kind of middle of the role, Travis Kelce, sit down in the zone kind of guy, which is nice for Bryce Young to have a dump down option. But he is going to need an X receiver that can separate, and we saw that in Diontae Johnson. Last week, before he got pulled, he had a 35% target share. If they're even a little bit closer in this game, even a little bit better, and some of those targets end up being completions, this guy could have been like a round 10 league winner for you. I don't think the Chargers are world beaters on defense, especially in the secondary. Outside of Derwin James, I don't think they have elite cornerback talent. I think Diontae Johnson should be able to get separation. And 35% target share, I don't care what offense you're in. I want in on that. So I'm starting Diontae Johnson in all of the leagues I have him. I know it's risky starting anything on the Panthers offense, but I believe in the talent of Diontae Johnson.
That's a good point. I didn't know he had a 35% target share prior to
getting
getting pulled.
In the fourth quarter, actually. So that number dropped, but before he got pulled, it was 35%. There is a
good to know
that I retweeted. Go follow me on Twitter.
We'll drop Ian's Twitter also in the description below. Luke, remind me of the stuff I have to put in the description. I'm going to forget. I'm going to say like 8 things, and I'm going to put none of them. So love that. I'm going to get into my first player, which is Tank Dell. So Tank Dell last week, it was kind of the odd man out when you look at this offense. You had Stephon Diggs score 2 touchdowns. You had Nico Collins go for over 100 yards. And it kind of left Tank Dell in this weird spot where you're like, all right, this is what I was worst. This was my worst fear going to the season, that Tank Dell was going to be the man left behind. But that wasn't actually the case. He had a 22.6 target share. He was right behind Nico Collins, who had a 25.8% target share. Dell only played 63% of the snaps, but when they took him out of the game, it was because they were running the ball. And when Joe Mixon has 30 attempts on the ground, that's because they're running the ball a lot. So Dell didn't really get the best chance the first week, and he still, he didn't put up piss poor numbers, but it wasn't enough to make you happy for fantasy. What would have made you happy, though, is if CJ Stroud did not miss him on an easy 41-yard touchdown, which happened during that game, and we would have been talking about Tank Dell very differently in this game. Now, the Bears have a great secondary. Luke mentioned it before. Jalen Johnson. I think we talked about this before the episode started, but Jalen Johnson kind of locked down. Was it DeAndre Hopkins last week? So Jalen Johnson locked down DeAndre Hopkins last week. He's a perimeter corner. And when it comes to the Texans receivers, you have Stephon Diggs and Nico Collins kind of playing more in that perimeter. And you have Tank Dell playing in the slot, who's probably going to have the best matchup out of each of the three receivers going into this week. So I'm a fan of Tank Dell this week. I'm going to start him as, most people who have him will, but it'll be with a little more confidence going to this week's matchup. And I don't think the Texans are going to have the same luck they did running the ball, even though Tony Pollard looked pretty good running against the Bears defense last week. I think they're going to lock that down, and they're going to have to rely on their receivers. So I'm a fan of Tank Dell this week. So that's my first player, and that was all our first players. So Luke, that brings it back to you. Who is your second player you want to talk about?
I guess I'll be the first one to bring the pessimism then. With Kenneth Walker here. He had a great week 1, better than I expected. I'm sure it was probably better than you expected too, Joe. They ran the football a lot more than we thought they were going to in Seattle based on their offensive coordinator hire, the weapons they have at wideout. But Kenneth Walker was really the focal point of that offense. It was against the Broncos. It was against Bo Nix. They were airing the ball out themselves to much less effective results. So the Seahawks were up big from the beginning. Mike McDonald's defense was playing very well. This week, they're playing the Patriots, who I know a lot of people had tabbed as one of the worst teams in the league coming into the year. But we just saw what that defense did to the Bengals in week 1. And granted, Jamar Chase obviously playing to not get hurt, going down basically the second he caught the ball. T. Higgins out, new running backs, lost their offensive coordinator. A lot of things going wrong for the Bengals, but I don't think you can discount how hard that Patriots defense played for Gerard Mayo last week at all. I think this is going to be a much closer game, a much scrappier game than a lot of people expect. I think the Seahawks are going to need to air the ball out. And most importantly, I think they're going to be in a lot of third down situations. I don't think they're going to be able to run the ball very effectively. And if they're in these third down situations, Kenneth Walker is not going to be on the field for all of them. He did have a decent snap share, even better than he did last year, but Zach Charbonnet still saw the field very often on third downs. They like him as a pass blocker. They like his receiving prowess. I think he's going to get on the field more. And even if Kenneth Walker does still get, that 65%, 70% snap share, I'm not confident he's going to be able to run the ball effectively into this Patriots front, who this defense has to keep the game close for the Patriots to be in it. And I think they're going to be able to do that this week.
Wow, Patriots confidence from a Giants fan. I'm loving this. I want to just hear more and more about this. But okay, yeah, good points. I think the Patriots, as a Patriots fan, I think they did play a lot better than I even expected. I was watching the game. I'm like, who is this? Is this? I can't believe what I'm seeing right now. The defense looks great. But yeah, so a lot of happiness for me. But Ian, why don't you go into your second player here, who you have?
Sure. I've got Marvin Harrison Jr. as my second player. I am going to be on the total opposite end of Luke, and I'm just going to be all sunshine and rainbows today. This is an elite caliber prospect, a cannot miss prospect. Please stop freaking out. I cannot stand the thumbnails of maybe we shouldn't drafted this guy as a number. Shut up. I'm so sick of seeing that. First half, they were kind of beating the brakes off the Bills a little bit. They didn't really have a lot of opportunity or need to throw the ball. In that second half, it really comes down to how they used him. The Bills defense likes to take away big plays. They run 2 high safeties almost every play. And they're usually in man, but sometimes they're in just like a quarters where they're just dropping 4 people into the back and just letting the underneath stuff live. And Marvin Harrison's route tree, this is according to PFF stats that I saw a breakdown on by Theo Ash on TikTok. If you don't follow him, you should. He is a fantastic follow, does really good film breakdowns. In this breakdown, he showed that in the second half, Marvin Harrison ran 0 slants, 0 outs, and 0 comebacks. And he ran 11 go, post, and corner routes total. So this man was running directly into 2 safeties for an entire half. And we're blaming Kyler Murray. When Kyler Murray says in the postseason or post-game interview that it is not his job to get Marvin the ball, that is not saying he doesn't like Marvin Harrison. That's saying, I'm not going to throw the ball in the double coverage just because you want fantasy points, which is his job at the end of the day. He's going to be fine. They're not going to be able to play 2 high safety every single time against Marvin Harrison. He's going to have better matchups. I'm starting him until the wheels fall off. Start Marvin Harrison Jr.
Wow. Ian coming in with 2 bold takes to start out his players. He got start Diontae Johnson, start Marvin Harrison Jr. We're rolling. I love it. And by the way, Marvin Harrison Jr. should not be bold take, as you mentioned too. It's really not his fault. I think some concern for people might be the speed if he was clocked at 16 miles per hour, which, I mean, if it's really true what you're saying in terms of like he's just running go routes, post routes, corner routes the whole second half, it's like at some point I'd probably just get tired or like stop trying.
Why are you running 22 miles an hour into double coverage? There's no point.
There's no point. So that kind of speaks to why that was the case. So interesting, really good to know. I'm going to move on with my second player here, Jerome Ford, who, as long as Chubb is out, looks to be the workhorse for this team in a very tough matchup against Dallas, which is, in the last couple of years at least, has been one of the best defenses against running backs specifically. Ford had a 17.5% target share, 7 targets, right behind, I think, Jerry Jeudy, who was the number 1 target earner. I know Luke's smiling about that. But so, yeah, I mean, second in targets on this team. He played 75% of snaps. He had 18 touches. And that's a great sign for a guy who we thought, last year he kind of split a little with Kareem Hunt, as he has done with Nick Chubb being out. But it seems like the Browns have full confidence with him as a starter. Not really too much to add, but I mean, just start him. Just start him. Don't worry about it. He's got a decent matchup against the Jaguars. They were pretty stout against running backs last week, but they did allow the Miami running backs to get over almost 100 yards when it comes to catching the ball. So I think even if Jerome Ford can't get it done on the ground, and he will get it done in short yardage because he is their goal line back, he will get it done as a pass catcher because, they really don't have too many options, and Sean Watson is struggling to get the ball downfield. So I like Jerome Ford this week and every week going forward until Chubb returns, if Nick Chubb does return. So we got our last players here. We're making great time. Luke, tell us about your last player.
Yep. And I mean, this has kind of turned into a hybrid discussion now, but I'll go with DeAndre Hopkins. I'm not a fan of DeAndre Hopkins, and I guess I'll get into Calvin Ridley in a second because they're kind of tied at the hip here. But Titans, tough matchup against the Jets. We saw Sauce Gardner kind of lock down Brandon Ayuk. Now, they don't really necessarily shadow with Sauce Gardner. They kind of just leave him on his island there because they have confidence in the rest of their secondary as well. But I guess the Niners are a little different in that there's no real use having him cover Debo, who's going to get, like the pop passes in the very, very short game. So they kind of just told Sauce to make sure Ayuk doesn't beat them, and he did that successfully. In last week, we saw Jalen Johnson, as you said, lock up DeAndre Hopkins. And again, discussing before this, I found out myself that apparently Treylon Burks out-routed DeAndre Hopkins last week. Hopkins is coming back from injury and all, so you expect that to get a little bit better over time. But not expecting much from him this week. I think he's probably going to see most of Sauce Gardner. Calvin Ridley, they like to get in the slot. They like to move him around. He didn't see much of Johnson at all last week. So I would expect Gardner to generally be around DeAndre Hopkins. So I'm not expecting much from him at all. So I guess you could also argue on the flip side there that Calvin Ridley is a half decent start as well. But my main focus is Hopkins. I'm not going anywhere near him this week.
Interesting. Okay, yeah, and I think Ian, you were the one who kind of mentioned you saw that Treylon Burks was out routing him. Do you have any thoughts on the Titans pass catchers and who you trust, if you do trust anyone?
Week 1 is a liar. Hopkins is coming off an injury. Treylon Burks did what with those targets or those routes exactly? I'm not concerned about Treylon Burks. It was mostly just a funny thing when Luke said he was throwing in D-Hop. It's Calvin Ridley. It's Calvin Ridley. And it's Calvin Ridley. I don't have much faith in DeAndre Hopkins. His separation ability has kind of gone downhill a lot. He is still an elite 50-50 ball guy, but at this point, I see him more as like a Stephon Diggs, elite hands underneath, and maybe can just like garner attention on the outside. But I don't have any shares of anyone other than Calvin Ridley in that Titans offense.
Yeah, makes sense. As do I. I'm in a similar boat. But Ian, why don't you end it off with your third guy, and then I'll go into mine.
Cool. So my third guy, again, optimism here. Mark Andrews. It's a bad matchup, and I'm sick of seeing people freak out about week 1 things. One matchup is not a projection for a season. He has notoriously kind of played bad against the Chiefs, but I think that's more so because the Chiefs have a good game plan for him. They take away Lamar's best option. I think they kind of almost prefer Lamar to be on the ground a little bit. They want to keep them controlling the clock. They just want to limit big plays. The Chiefs offense and the Chiefs game plan just always kind of centers around the idea of we're going to score more points than you. So if we get to slow you guys down to a halt, we're going to score when we have the ball. And that works for them a lot of the time. And sometimes it means they put up 40. Sometimes it means they put up 27. But in this game, you saw a lot of jamming Mark Andrews off the line. I saw a couple plays where linebackers were lined up over him and just stuffed him on the line. It didn't even let him get into his route. They wanted Lamar to go anywhere other than Mark Andrews. But we still saw him out-snap Isaiah Likely. We saw him out-route Isaiah Likely. He's a big part of this offense. And I think they knew that the Chiefs were going to take that away, and they ran a lot of complementary routes where Mark Andrews is kind of leading the defense one way and Likely is kind of running over him or underneath him and getting open. They did a lot to scheme Flowers and Likely open based off of where the coverage was going with Mark Andrews. It really just comes down to bad matchup, good scheme from the Ravens giving what they were taking. I do like Likely still, but I don't think this is like the end of Mark Andrews. They'll be fine. And honestly, they don't really have a second passing option outside of Zay Flowers. So I think this offense can support 2 elite tier tight ends. So I'm not really worried about either.
Yeah, and I think this 2 tight ends on the same team being fantasy relevant is not new to the NFL and fantasy football either. So that's also very much a possibility. And even if they trade off to where, again, 1 week they're using Mark Andrews almost as like a decoy, as you mentioned, where he's running one route to kind of open up space in another area. We could see some trade-off between Isaiah Likely having a big week and Mark Andrews having a big week. And honestly, if you have a tight end who at this point is good every other week, that's pretty good. That
it might be good for tight end 6 this year. It really might be.
The bar is very low. If Isaiah Likely gets 25 points every other week, I'm happy with that, because the alternative is a tight end who is getting maybe 10 or just over 10 every single week. So not the worst case, even if that ends up being the case. So I'm going to end it off with my player here, which is I'm joining kind of the pessimism here with Aaron Jones. So Aaron Jones last week got a terrible Giants defense and team overall. There you go. Super Bowl champions. Oh, look at that. I'm surrounded by Giants fans. I love that for me.
We've got to remember the good times, man.
Oh, I'm a Patriots fan. Trust me, the good times are well in the rearview mirror at this point for me as well. But Aaron Jones, he's not a workhorse, right? And I think that's kind of getting a little confused because he did see, I think it was 17 touches. He had a touchdown, and some people might take away from that and be like, oh, that's awesome. But him and Ty Chandler were rotating drives in a form of like actually taking turns. And there's data to support this from the Underdog website. I have a graph that I'm going to put up hopefully on YouTube if I remember. Luke, help me remember. But it's a situational graph to where you can, it breaks down by the minute which player you see on the field. You see Aaron Jones, Ty Chandler, Aaron Jones, Ty Chandler, Aaron Jones, Ty Chandler. It is a perfect split between drives. Aaron Jones did get 2 goal line carries, which is different from Chandler, but they did not pull Chandler to put Aaron Jones in on those goal line situations, which I think is also notable. So it wasn't a situation where like Ty Chandler was on the goal line, they pulled him and they put Jones in. I'm sure if they had a goal line situation with Chandler, they would have just let him take that. So it doesn't mean Aaron Jones has a goal line role. He was involved as a pass catcher, but Ty Chandler had a higher target share. So it's not a situation where we can be confident about either one of these guys. Aaron Jones did start the game, which I think is important, but regardless, they had a great matchup last week. This week, they're going against the 49ers defense. There's going to be a perfect split between these two. I don't know what kind of target share we're going to see out of Aaron Jones. I don't know what kind of target share we're going to see out of Ty Chandler, but I'm staying away from this backfield if you can, depending on where you draft Aaron Jones. And by the way, I also just want to mention that when we say to start a player, or when we say to sit a player, be smart about it as well. Just like if we're saying start Diontae Johnson, does that mean I bench CeeDee Lamb because CeeDee Lamb? Like, no. Like, be mindful here. When I'm saying to sit Aaron Jones, if your only other option is like the 4th string wide receiver, like for the Bucks, it's like, no, do not sit Aaron Jones for this guy. Just like be mindful about who you're sitting them for. If you have Aaron Jones and another good option, maybe you have Aaron Jones and Diontae Johnson in PPR league. I'd say, okay, yeah, make that move. Start Diontae Johnson over him. But just be mindful about who you're sitting and who you're starting. Yes, we're giving advice about these certain players, but take it with a grain of salt, go with your gut, and like be smart about it. So
always start your studs.
Always start your studs. So yeah, that's gonna do it. Thank you guys for being here. That was a pretty efficient episode. 47 minutes. I think the new strategy, we got it down here. Final reminder to you guys, make sure you go on Underdog, use code ANALYST. We're going to be putting our picks. That's right. There you go, Ian. We're going to be putting our picks every Thursday for those games, but you guys can take advantage of pick'ems all weekend long. This week, they have a free CeeDee Lamb pick, or if he gets over half a yard, which, shoe in, you kind of get, you win that point. So if you want to put CeeDee Lamb as part of a bigger pick'em, they also have drafts where you can draft like 4 people drafts. You can draft the whole team from that format. So yeah, enjoy that. Check that out. Thank you guys for being here, Ian and Luke, and we'll see you guys next week.